We're here with Junot Diaz. Thank you so much for joining us today. So let's get right into it. So you were here in Miami last year for the Book Fair International to promote this How You Loser. How do you like Miami?
I know Miami pretty well. I have a lot of relatives here. My father lives down in this area.
Really?
And his 13 brothers and sisters. I have, I think it's 13. I always lose count if they officially count one or not.
Okay.
But muchísimo tío aquí, muchísima familia. So, yeah, no, you know, Miami's wonderful. You know,
right.
It's like all these places where all our families gather. It's hard to see the place for the family sometimes.
Yeah, that's true. And it's definitely a different place than it was maybe like 5-6 years ago. The arts are huge here now. Have you ever been to like around Wynwood or?
Yeah, no, my uncle's an artist,
Okay.
my tío Marco, and so he's sort of kept me abreast of how much it's transformed. I mean, you know the deal. The reputation for those of us who've lived in New York from Miami is it's sort of like the reputation for a long time was that Miami was the airhead city.
Yeah.
It was a place where you could do anything you wanted con tu cuerpo, but there wasn't much for your coco.
Okay.
And so things have changed tremendously, even for an outsider like me, who just visits a couple times a year.
Right. Okay, now, you did mention that you reside in a lot of, I read an interview where you reside in Harlem and Cambridge, right?
I do.
Two very Dominican neighborhoods that keeps you whole. So you're familiar with Alapata, you've been around here?
Yeah, I mean, again, like, what, I could take you on a tour? Hell no.
No.
Have I been taken? Yeah. I mean, look, the thing is that, like, as far as the Dominican community is concerned, though I live in Cambridge, my friends are Dominicans. The actual place is not Dominican. And down in this area, my God, Florida is like, Florida for all Latinos, it's in many ways the second Mecca outside of New York City.
Yeah.
And for some groups, it's the first Mecca, man. This is like the capital.
Oh, definitely, definitely. Now you're back again this year to promote the deluxe edition of This Is How You Loser. Features illustrations of Uner's failed loves, and all done by the iconic comic book artist and co-author of Love and Rockets, Jaime Hernandez. What was it like to work with somebody whose work you followed since your college years?
Yeah, no, it was a tremendous honor. I mean, look, I just kind of geeked out to the maximum. It was just one of those things where, you know, if your bag is Derek Jeter and you get to spend like a couple weeks hanging out with Derek Jeter, that's the thing that you're going to be thinking about for a long, long time. Look, my bag has been Love and Rockets since I was a kid, man, back when I actually had hair. And so for me, having an opportunity to have my favorite artist, the one who taught me most about representing our community, collaborate with me has just been something that has put me completely over the moon, man.
Okay. Any favorite illustrations of any particular one of the girls?
No, you know, it's so funny because there's an illustration for Oscar Wilde that he did of Lola that is my absolute favorite, but it doesn't appear in this book.
Okay.
It's in the New Yorker. It's just a remarkable piece.
Okay. Well, if I remember Lola correctly, it's probably a Venus, Dominican Venus.
Yeah, it's one of those pictures, man.
Yeah. So recently, Steve Almond was in town. It's a man that you consider one of our finest literary provocateurs. And he taught at the FIU Writers Conference this year. One of his classes was on obsession and how it's a necessary engine of literature. So through both Oscar and Junior, you display like a real encyclopedic knowledge of comics, genre novels, film. Tell me a little bit about how your obsessions play into your process.
Yeah, I mean, but it's hard to parse these things, you know, because, you know, I'm always super cautious about valorizing one kind of emotional stream or one sort of mind state over another, because in my experience what I do is so, and I'm sure it's like everyone else's, but just for me personally, it's so hard to just disaggregate or disentangle what in the world I'm up to. You know, like my usage of comics and my usage of science fiction and my usage of these things is a strategy. And it shouldn't be too readily confused with my own personal stake in it, which sounds like a lot of like fancy talk. But what I mean by it is that like the kind of science fiction and comics and weird nerdy stuff that I give my characters is not in fact the stuff I like in this field.
Okay.
So that what I like in this field and how I like it tends to be very different from my characters.
Right.
I take, for example, sports. Let's say you know sports really well, and I'll give my characters different teams than what I like.
Okay.
So, I mean, for me, I think part of it is, sure, our knowledge about the world filters into our work.
Okay.
But it's not just simply filters in because we're obsessed with it. I think for my case, it tends to be something that's rather strategic, and that I think illuminates a kind of a world that I want to take a look at. And so that I didn't grow up with characters who were quoting Flaubert, you know, and were just, you know, talking about Seneca and making these kind of classic sort of references. I grew up with people who grew up with the X-Men, and so it seemed like a real interesting way to remind the generation that I grew up with how much pop culture was our touchstone, how much pop culture was, for the kind of kids I grew up with, very much a cultural common. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure I fit into this, but I'm also like kind of need to reinforce that a lot of times these things are strategies and things that we put into motion because we have a project, and less just because it's embedded in our hearts. I tend to write with incredibly cold blood. I tend to write with an incredibly cold head. And the joke for me is that the work seems to be anything but.
Okay. All right. Now, obsessions aside, there is one that you have actually admitted to liking, which is post-apocalyptic subject matter. It's one of your favorite classes to teach. You and an Oscar have a fixation with it as well. Now, where do you think that comes from? It's not in just you, but in society as a whole, because, you know, you have books like The Road and all kinds of post-apocalyptic themes abound. So where do you think that would come from?
You know, there's a wide range of scholarship about why, and certainly a whole series of theses of why this might be the case, why we have such a strong tendency towards the apocalyptic and the post-apocalyptic. Part of it, of course, is that this is something that is embedded in the Western culture. Our visions of time, our visions of history have been informed by a biblical framework. And so the idea that there's a logic to time, that eventually we're going to come to this place where there's going to be this huge trial and tribulation, that the world ends, that there's a tick-tock in the universe.
Right.
This is kind of embedded in the way that the West has viewed its historiography for a long time. There's also the fact that the apocalyptic as a metaphor, the apocalyptic as a genre, the apocalyptic as a set of signs and codes has been incredibly useful for people who are living in a period that seems incredibly unstable,
right.
A period that has been like overdetermined by sort of post-apocalyptic or apocalyptic occurrences. After the atomic bomb, a lot of writers say we all became apocalyptics, we all became post-apocalyptics. In a moment when it feels like we're completely devouring the world, where ecological devastation is having sort of planetary repercussions. Again, the post-apocalyptic is a useful way for us to enact and perhaps resolve some of our anxieties around it. You know, and then finally that there's this idea that people say that it's far easier coming out of Frederick Jameson on up, that it's part of our blocked inability to imagine the future in any productive way. Jameson is quoted as saying, or misquoted as saying, that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And so it's almost like a surrogate for our inability to imagine a better future the way our desires are, that we want to see a world where things end up better, but we've been so trained that that's such an impossibility, that the only futures we can imagine are sort of chiliastic, you know, just these gloomy, terrible things. And so there's a whole wide range. I mean, for me specifically, I grew up with the post-apocalyptic because I grew up in the, you know, under the shadow of Dr. Manhattan in the 80s nuclear war terror. And those of us who grew up in this time know that to be a child, to be a young person, to be sensitive and open meant that you were very aware of the nuclear terror that hung over the entire globe like a sword of Damocles.
Okay. All right. And I read in a Salon interview that you mentioned that your readership is predominantly female. How would you account for that?
Oh God, I don't know. I mean, I always think it's the worst thing. I wish I had never interviewed anyone. I've never done any interviews because I'm always at a disadvantage. People read old interviews and then quote it back to me, and it's like a cross-examination. They don't mean it to be, but structurally it's like a cross-examination because I don't have any memory. I'm like, Your Honor, I don't remember saying any of this. But okay, but let's see if I could answer this in some ways. Look, first of all, I mean, you don't need to be a bookseller to know that women do a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to reading. Women read an enormous amount. Women tend to be the ones who are putting book groups together. Yeah, part of it is the culture, literary culture. Part of it, of course, has to do with, you know, I tend to be writing about relationships and I tend to be writing about families. And while this is not necessarily a universal truth, a lot of folks tend to think, oh, well, this isn't stuff for boys. Or, you know, women will be like, oh, I've been sort of socialized to think that this is more my realm. And then just God knows why a certain group is attracted to any book. You know, I'm just kind of lucky to have any readers.
Yeah. All right. So I just have one more question. It's more of a game than a question. It's
sure.
a little game we like to play at the Gulfstream offices. It's called Date, Marry, Destroy. So you're going to pick 3 literary characters at random from this awesome Juan Pablo Duarte Cup. And say which one you date, marry, or destroy.
Lord, so hopefully these are not people, right?
No, they're literary characters.
Okay.
Fictional literary characters.
Right.
Some you may know very well.
I was hoping there would be ideologies. Because people I don't like to hurt or even like fantasize
so
about.
Instead of destroy, dump.
Yeah, no, I just mean, look, I'm an old sensitive guy these days. Let's see. Julia.
From 1984, Julia.
Yeah, Julia from 1984.
Did you get 3?
Yeah, I'll get the last one. Julia from 1984. Well, come on. I mean, the context of this is so horrible. I would give her like. One must understand. It's like.
She was a snake, though.
Yeah, but the context is important. Who isn't a snake?
Sure.
My thing is like we're on camera and we're all heroes when we're on cameras.
Yeah.
When we're in our own heads and the truth of us is present, we know that we are not as brave as we like to pretend. I guess my thing would be just compassion for her.
Compassion.
And then Grendel's mother, Sycorax, that's the name that Brathwaite gives her.
Okay.
Sycorax, Grendel's mom is another figure. Again, I would want to know what Grendel's mom went through. Okay. So I would want to interview Grendel's mom to know why in the world she's this way, you know, because sometimes I find my mom was probably, you know, came from a similar tough background, made her seem almost perhaps difficult. And then, Maggie Chascarillo from Love and Rockets. Maggie, I would definitely wish I could have met in college. She would have changed my life.
Yeah.
That's a date right off the bat.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, man. Thank you, guys.